We're going to be speaking about floral collectivism, about southeastern plant epistemologies in relation to Alexandra Pirici's research describing a movement observing through embodiment.
In the marshes of the Lower Danube, there are still whole square miles as untouched as if man had not yet begun his conquest of the globe. As far as the eye can reach, a wilderness of reeds sprinkled with thickets of willow and alder, penetrated with tiny brooklets, whose golden brown or dark green waters lead to hidden laughing lakes, where water lilies bloom and thousand strange flowers nod, and great herons gather in ancient eyries, where pelicans sit upon the trees and countless waterfowls conduct a deafening concert, where also millions of bloodthirsty insects stand guard over this paradise to prevent intrusion.
This is the opening passage of Germs of Mind in Plants, published in 1905 by Raoul Heinrich Francais, an Austro-Hungarian botanist and microbiologist who did pioneering work on understanding solar relations, using a microscope to uncover its ecological complexity. In this short book, the Central European scientist opened up questions around vegetal consciousness and plant agency, while his microbiological perspective on the interconnectedness of the natural world, as is visible also in this description of the Danube Delta, also determined his understanding of the dynamic relation of plants with other species.
A little further in the book, he recalls the conversation with a local fisherman in the Danube Delta who told him, "I don't know whether you will believe me, but there is a plant on the island that covers itself at night. That's no fairy tale, I've seen it myself." When Francais agreed with him and told the fisherman more about the sleep of flowers and plants, Francais recounts that the fisherman began to treat me as an equal, and from then on he disclosed to me a wealth of marvels and a deep knowledge of life of nature, which can be attained only through long and close communion with it. Reflecting on this exchange, the scientist noted how great source of true wisdom we have neglected by giving so little attention to such people in our culture, and how we have therefore excluded the whole great mass of popular wisdom from our science. Today, this wisdom is hidden and disguised in tales, superstitions, and proverbs, or else dies unspoken because no one asks for it, he noted.
Significantly, this reveals that extractive science of the Anthropocene had no use for an integrated understanding of the natural world or appreciation of native wisdom about it, as its primary aim was to instrumentalize nature and convert it into an expendable resource for capitalist exploitation. What is also striking from today's perspective is that scientists are still discussing and attempting to prove what the fisherman knew from his own experience and observation, a debate made more urgent still by climate change. Furthermore, Francais' research could be seen as a form of Senzu Scholarship, an investigation of situated knowledge, and, by looking to non-scientific sources, he was also expanding epistemologies. Drawing attention to the importance of symbiotic relationships in nature, his work is also a starting point to consider how to translate the complexity of plant ways of being into a form that is accessible within the limited spectrum of human perception. Now, these are some of the questions that we want to expand on further here.
First of all, mainstream Western science, with its forceful maintaining of a dualistic conception of rigid divide between culture and nature, has long deemed plants to be unmoving, inactive, unthinking, unfeeling, and inanimate. In fact, plant neurobiologists have recently debunked such assumptions by providing evidence for the ability of plants to solve problems, to memorize, to communicate, and have social life. In his brilliant Green, The Surprising History and Science of Plant Intelligence, Stefano Mancuso shows that plants operate according to a different set of principles based on their modular and distributed strategy for interacting with the world, which enables them to breathe without lungs, nourish themselves without mouth or stomach, stand erect without skeleton, and make decisions without a brain. In difference to animals, Plants acquire everything they need to live from the earth, the air and the sun, and they also move to capture light and escape danger, even migrating in response to climate change, although at imperceptibly slow speeds. Plant neurobiologists have also explored the particular ways in which they use smell as a form of language, communicate with each other and other animals, and hear through vibrations, see light and dark, notice and react to touch, and engage in sexual relations.
That the misconceptions around plants are deeply embedded in Western cultures and languages is also suggested by the associations of the vegetative state to describe a condition of being incommunicative and insensitive to your environment. In fact, as Mancuso also shows in his book The Incredible Journey of Plants, plants are far more sensitive than animals. He uses the example of the ability of plants through their roots to detect chemical and physical parameters of the soil, such as the presence of cobalt, to which humans are blind, to make this point. Far from being silent and passive, plants are social and communicative, above ground and beneath, through their roots and fungal networks. Along with the ability to detect subtle electromagnetic fields generated by other life forms, they deploy chemicals and scents to warn each other of danger or to deter predators and attract pollinating insects. Mancuso gives the example of corn, which when eaten by caterpillars emits a chemical distress signal that lures wasps to exterminate the caterpillars. The experiments of his plant neurobiology lab have also discovered that plants are sensitive to specific types of sound through feeling vibrations, enabling them to seek and follow the sound of running water. Contemporary science emphasizes the agency of plants in, for example, starting symbiotic relationships with other organisms such as bacteria, mushrooms, and insects, as well as humans, which they've used to get transported across the world.
So this is where the plant neurobiology connects with our early 20th century scientist Frances, and in terms of plants covering themselves up at night to sleep, it has been observed that just like animals, many plants change their sleeping posture during the night, but they generally return to the rolled up position that they had during germination, and also younger plants sleep longer than the older ones, who also find it more difficult to get to sleep. More generally, as Mancuso noted, if sleep is an essential component of life and plants have intelligence and ability to think, then it is reasonable to assume that plant sleep has an analogous role to that of sleep for humans and animals.
We'd like now to look briefly at some of the ways that contemporary art has engaged with plant agency and the critique of anthropocentric attitudes to plant worlds. The possibility of transcending the language barrier between people and plants was investigated by artist and composer Christine Ertlund in her work Stress Call of the Stinging Nettle. Her electroacoustic piece and graphic score was based on observation of how stinging nettles react when attacked by butterfly larvae feeding on their leaves. Collaborating with researchers into ecological chemistry at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, she translated the smells released by the plant as a chemical distress signal into a musical piece. Biochemical changes taking place on nettle leaves over a period of days were compressed into a composition lasting minutes in order to convey the non-human timescale over which conversations between plants take place. The botanical drawings on the score further visualize scientific findings into the reaction of neighboring nettle plants to the chemical warning to the caterpillar attack, with the neighboring plants channeling their energy into their root systems until the danger has passed.
In his work, The Pudic Relation Between Machine and Plant, New York-based Portuguese artist Pedro Neves Marques used a robotic hand to instigate a reaction from the leaves of Mimosa pudica, a particular type of sensitive mimosa, whose behavior demonstrates the capability of plants to experience the sense of touch. Namely, as soon as it is exposed to direct physical contact, the plant retracts its leaves as if shy, which explains its name. However, it does not act in the same way in the case of wind or rain, and it stops closing the leaves once it detects no danger in the impulse, displaying therefore also the ability to think or to memorize the type of touch it had already experienced. The use of bionic prosthesis could also be viewed as a critical comment on the common misconception that views plants as semi-living organic machines. Recalling that the notion of pudic, with its entangled meanings of sexual organs, shyness and modesty, derived from Carl Linnaeus' sexual taxonomy of plants, the artist also referenced the sexual adventures of British botanist Joseph Banks during his expedition to the South Pacific in 1768, which were alluded to in the poem Love of Plants by Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin. Not coincidentally, these islands were also new territories adopted by Mimosa pudica that originated in South America. Apart from pointing to the inextricable links of botanical history to environmental colonialism, the work also questions the ability of modern science and technology to capture the nuances of vegetal life.
Challenging heteronormative assumptions in plant science brings a new understanding of the multiplicity of vegetal life, or, as theorist Teresa Castro has put it, to queer botanics is to recognize plant nature as queer nature. Such an expanded understanding of queerness was at stake in Chinese artist Zheng Bo's filmic exploration of sexual intimacy with plants, pteridophilia, in which naked men interact with 3 species of fern in a Taiwanese forest. Experimenting with love and desire between not just species but biological kingdoms made the artist aware of the queerness of the sexuality of ferns, which over generations alternate between producing sperm and eggs to just making spores. In other words, between a binary and a singular sexuality. Motivating these transgressive entanglements between queer men and ferns was the artist's sense of the pressing need at a time of ecological breakdown to develop truly intimate relations with other species, which alongside activism deepens the solidarities on which the survival of all depends.
Engaging with vegetal life worlds is not just a matter of understanding the degree to which, in fact, they share in different forms many of the characteristics and abilities that are usually assumed to be restricted to animals or humans, but also finding a way to comprehend their otherness and the ways in which they exceed the limits of the animal kingdom. In order to think about the different timescales that plants exist on, American artist Rachel Sussman has sought out and made portrait photographs of the oldest plants on Earth. These include Greenlandic lichens that grow only 1 centimeter per century, also 5,500-year-old moss in Antarctica, and 43,600-year-old self-propagating shrub in Tasmania, all of which she approaches as individuals in order to facilitate an anthropomorphic connection to a deep timescale otherwise too physiologically challenging for our brain to internalize.
It is in this scientific and artistic context that we consider Alexandra Pirici's artistic research entitled Describing in Movement, Observing Through Embodiment, which investigates the movement and dynamics of vegetal life through choreographic translations for human bodies, and expanding through this research into plant life the anthropocentric understanding of sociality, cognition, and intelligence.
The long dominance of a mechanistic and reductive attitude to the plant world cannot be explained simply through lack of knowledge or evidence as a result of an internal process of scientific or theoretical debate, but also reflected the types of questions and answers demanded by the social and economic system, which continues to have an important role in setting the agenda for what was previously assumed to be disinterested scientific research. The prevalence of instrumentalizing and one-dimensional attitudes towards plants mirrored the priorities of an economic system based on extractivism, or as theorist Michael Marder put it in A Philosophy of Vegetal Life, treating plants as less developed than their animal or human counterparts rendered them unconditionally available for unlimited use and exploitation. There are echoes here of what is in the context of our work on plants and empire, colonial bioprospecting in the Atlantic world, Londa Schiebinger refers to as agnotology, or the ways Europeans chose to remain ignorant about certain aspects of botanical knowledge. As she writes, funding priorities, global strategies, national policies, structure of scientific institutions, trade patterns, and gender politics all pushed investigation towards certain parts of nature and away from others.
The long neglect of France's work on plants and soil relations, especially in Anglophone science, until his equally telling recent rediscovery, could be explained partly by the fact that he worked in an East European scientific institute and also published in German. More importantly, perhaps, his work on the complex ecological relations between plants and soil fell outside of the interests of a scientific establishment that was institutionally entwined with the commercial interests of petroagriculture, which in the same period of the first half of the 20th century was engineering the transformation of farming from a system of crop rotation to one based on dependence on chemical additives of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. The dominance of chemically intensive industrial agriculture could be said to have silenced or nullified the work of scientists looking at the more complex realities of subterranean networks of cooperation and exchange between species. Indeed, it is only as commercial farming has, in the age of climate change, come up against the problem of soil fatigue, as productivity and yields are falling despite ever-increasing doses of chemicals, that there is a new readiness in the scientific community to see plants as intelligent collaborators rather than semi-lifeless machines.
The fact that Western science is finally taking seriously the idea that nature and the universe is alive has also been noted by plant physiologist Rupert Sheldrake. He has described the ways in which not just animals and plants, but all self-organizing systems, such as solar system, can be said to have a kind of mind and experience. While scientists have only recently come to the conclusion, as it's reflected in the so-called Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness from 2012, that animals have some form of consciousness, something that pet owners have long known, Sheldrake also commented that it's harder for humans to empathize with and also grasp the sentience of life forms such as plants, whose experience and forms of intelligence are less close to us. He also pointed out the example of indigenous, traditional and pre-modern beliefs about the natural world that are much closer to contemporary science than the alienated dualism of Cartesian modernity.
There is also an important sense in which the whole edifice of modern Western philosophy, based on the Cartesian dualistic divide between nature and culture, was itself inscribed within the system of colonial domination and economic exploitation. The call of Boaventura de Sousa Santos for an epistemological break from the Western-centric critical tradition, which he argued fails to account for the emancipatory struggles of our time because it shares the same epistemological foundations with the bourgeois order it seeks to criticize, also resonates with attempts to rethink human-plant relations in non-anthropocentric and non-extractivist ways. For the Portuguese decolonial theorist of Southern epistemologies, modern Western thinking is abyssal thinking that divides reality into the realm of this side of the line and the other side of the line, beyond which there is only non-existence, invisibility, and absence. In these terms, it's certainly the case that for Western modernity, the intelligence, relations, and complex life worlds of plants were firmly on the other side of the line. Equally, his view that as long as abyssally defined exclusion persists, no really progressive post-capitalist alternative is possible, must also logically be extended to the need to challenge and rethink oppressive attitudes and practices to other species, including the unreflecting habit of denying plants rights and consideration by placing them on the other side of the line.
Within the range of Southern epistemologies, there might also be room to think about the possibility of Eastern or Southeastern epistemologies in their historical and current confrontation with long dominant precepts of Western modernity. In fact, the title of our piece is borrowed from Soviet agronomist Trofim Lysenko, who developed the concept of floral collectivism as an exploration of alternatives to a genetics-based paradigm of plant evolution, and develop experimental farming methods more in tune with Marxist ideology. Setting aside the fierce debate over his controversial legacy within the former Soviet Union and Western scientific circles, some of his quirky theories and agricultural practices around plants under socialism are irresistible from today's perspective, such as Lysenko's proposal that trees should be planted closer together in circular formations rather than geometrical rows, in order to encourage proletarian solidarity between them. Although highly speculative, his notion of floral collectivism chimes with current interest in plant-plant relations and solidarities that pass between non-human species rather than being instrumentalized in the service of narrowly human interests. Such forms of solidarity have been alleged in recent scientific research in the ability of trees to communicate through fungal interfaces with their roots, and the role of mother trees in nurturing and protecting those in need of greater share of nutrients.
Returning to Francais, another relevant aspect for today's discussion could be deduced from the fact that his research was not just based on laboratory work that we associate with modern science, but actually based on field trips into the living environment that he was studying. We could refer here to social anthropologist Paul Stoller's book on Senzu Scholarship, which he described as an attempt to reawaken profoundly the scholar's body by demonstrating how the fusion of the intelligible and the sensible can be applied to scholarly practices and representations. As a critique of the disembodied gaze, such an approach held the possibility of ejecting the conceit of control in which mind and body, self and other, are considered separate, while opening sensuous ways of knowing to complexities, tastes, structures and spells. While he developed these observations in attempting to find a non-Eurocentric way to approach other human cultures as an anthropologist, the approach of an embodied sensual scholarship could equally be applied in the field of more than human anthropology, and the sensitive and empathic exploration of phytoculture in all its diversity. Sensuous scholarship was also an important aspect of the Danube River School that we worked on with a research visit to the Danube Delta, forming a core element of this collaborative research program.
While the question of embodiment is obviously a central question in Alexandra Pirici's work, we want to also point to the aspect of Senzu scholarship in her approach to artistic research. Since this work has developed in recent months, and the itinerary of the field trips were reshaped by the pandemic, the artist spent considerable amount of time in Germany over the summer months. There were two particular locations that are relevant in this context. One was the Elbe sandstone mountains in the area of Sächsische Schweiz, or Saxon Switzerland, south of the former East German city of Dresden on the border with Czech Republic. The region has a special place in the art history of landscapes, thanks to Caspar David Friedrich, who in 1799 undertook a hiking tour there and made numerous drawings during his excursions as the basis for all paintings, including the famous Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog from 1818, that are seen as epitomizing a certain school of the Romance's depiction of nature. However, his drawings have been described as displaying almost obsessive accuracy in recording the details of plants, trees, rocks, and stones, with the same passion that early botanists and geologists approached the landscape.
Another site for Pirici's artistic research was the Black Forest, the place where the Danube begins its 2,800 kilometre eastward journey towards the delta where it merges with the Black Sea. Alexandra expressed her impression that everything seemed pretty well regulated and large parts of it industrially planted after having been exploited, before finding some trails that go through older patches of the forest. As it happened, this summer we also spent some time in the Black Forest and had a similar impression of disconnect and disjuncture between the fame of the Black Forest and the Anthropocene reality of an overmanaged forestry plantation.
What also comes to mind is the late conceptual ecological artist Gustav Metzger's observation about the South German forests of his childhood. In a text on Nature Demise Resurrects as Environment, written in 1992, which was the year of UN Rio Earth Summit, the artist wrote, "If I were to return to the forest I knew as a child in the environs of Nuremberg, the forest I missed so much when I went to England as a refugee, I would react in a completely different way to my early experience. Instead of the profound calm I knew then, there would be feelings of unease and anxiety, fear even, and in place of deep colors that I observed, I would be faced with so many sights indicated that some radical change for the worse has occurred. It is not just nature that is wiped out, it is our memory that is overturned. It is our apprehension of a future in which people will not have that contact with forests, where an englobing experience was given, shelter, verdancy. Not knowing is a form of erasure."
The neat lines of the overmanaged forestry plantations of areas such as the Black Forest, in which monocultural trees grow quickly to maturity before being felled for timber, are the face of the industrial forest, in which natural processes are controlled and biodiversity much reduced. The diminished nature of industrial forests provokes solastalgia, a sorrow or longing for the lost natural world. The urgency of the current moment of ecological crisis is reflected just as much or even more in the remnants of primeval and ancient forests, such as the ones on the border of Poland and Belarus and between Ukraine and Romania, which are being ruthlessly logged in pursuit of profit and in accordance with a twisted nationalist logic that the country is free to use its natural resources as it chooses. It's also not just local people cutting trees for firewood, but mafia-scale operations that legalize illegally cut trees from old wood forests, which then find their way into the supply chains of the world's biggest furniture company, as has been widely reported. The tragedy of the cutting down of some of the last primary forests of Europe, with the complicity of politicians and industrialists, provokes not solastalgia, but outrage as a new climate politics comes face to face with climate uncertainty.
What we want to underscore here is that we cannot go into nature anymore or think about art, science, and theory of plants without understanding the devastating effects of anthropogenic climate change onto environments, habitats, species, and biodiversity. As Bruno Latour expressed it, new climate regime organizes all political affiliations. The climate question is not one aspect of politics among others, but that which defines the political order from beginning to end, forcing all of us to redefine the older questions of social justice along with those of identity, subsistence, and attachment to place.
2020 has been a year that profoundly changed perspectives on the planet and human relations with other species, with renewed understanding for a symbiotic planet, including seeing us humans as holobionts or hosts of other species, something that the virus has made particularly visible. This year, it was also announced that in terms of biodiversity, the world has lost 68% of animal populations since 1970, while, as we speak, the news is coming in that September 2020 has been the hottest month on record since these began 140 years ago. So, thinking about the integrated natural world as a way to re-establish and revitalise relations between humans and non-human terrestrials is more urgent than ever.
So we say goodbye from Epping Forest, which is behind us.